fingers to understand how to use the proper cross fingers, whatever it might be. But there's less time spent on sort of the how do you deal with the inner psychology part of being a teacher, given the strains and stresses and challenges. And my supposition, I don't know this for a fact, is that it's due to a couple of things. One is if you're the young teacher, while it's considered okay, cool, kosher to share your deficiencies related to repertoire knowledge, it's considered less cool, kosher, okay, to confess that you're struggling emotionally with teaching. It's just not something we rarely bring up. It's sort of like a male syndrome, right? Don't want to be in touch with your feelings. And the second thing is I think some mentors are a little bit less confident about how they can deal with those issues in terms of helping a young teacher navigate forward. And sometimes it can be kind of an age differential that contributes to that. But some can just be that you're maybe less confident about how to deal with that. But as we talked about, I mean, the first step is just be a good listener, right? I mean, just let the person talk and, nod your head. And you don't have to offer up a solution. Sometimes you just want someone to listen and you feel a lot better. We had the other conversation here about milkshakes. And just a little folk wisdom for you. So I'm reading a research study recently about how to kind of, reestablish a real productive state of mind and creative flow and that sort of thing. It had to do with writers, but the key suggestion was that just taking a walk can do an amazing thing for you. Just getting away, taking the stroll, not running, not trying to work up a cardiovascular sweat, but just walking, thinking through things. But the second most effective means is to go get ice cream. We were speculating that, taking the time to actually, you can't eat ice cream fast because you'll get a brain freeze, right? So it forces you to slow down, sort of engage your taste sense, whatever guilty pleasure you want to put on the ice cream, that's all. So think about that. When you're feeling stressed out, take a walk, go get some ice cream, and everything's good.
So I just very like if we're like in class and you can tell that people are stressed out or they're not focused or something, if you had them do an exercise where you had them like imagine that they were eating ice cream and like tasting it.
Maybe. I don't know. I wouldn't rule anything out. Yeah. If you can't actually get to the ice cream parlor with your class of 65 choristers, maybe what you can do is imagine your way. I don't know. But it does bring up the point that sometimes just, if things have been very intense, I'll never forget, when the 9/11 thing happened, and I was heading in, dropping my son off at daycare or preschool, and then I was heading into campus to have my junior level instrumental methods course. Well, what do you do under those circumstances, What do you do? So, obviously we didn't talk about, I don't know, what the topic of the day was, how to establish a scope and sequence with your instrumental program, what you want 5th graders to be able to play scale-wise, and 8th graders. We didn't do that. We just sort of talked about the events of the day. So that's, again, that human dimension of being a teacher, being sensitive when something happens. And sometimes it's, if people are just stressed out because there was a major exam that a lot of them had, let's say you have an 8th grade ensemble and they took a major exam and they're worried about it. Sometimes have to adapt and flow. Any other questions about sort of the early career challenge thing? Hopefully I've given you a little bit of realism, but also optimism, a little bit of inspiration that you can surmount those things. But you need a support network, and you also need to kind of figure out your own way of managing and coping with conflict and challenge. All right, assessment. I want to set the stage up until our break at 11:30, and then when we come back at 1, it's going to be pretty much sort of hands-on application, but let me get through some concepts. And my understanding, just from having spoken with a few of you now, is that you feel like this is an area that traditionally in the curriculum here, it could be taught over in the School of Ed, but it's decontextualized from music, so there isn't always the understanding about how the concepts would apply in music, and within the music curriculum, you don't really have the space or capacity to get into it in great depth. I would say you're not alone. This has sort of been a historical challenge for teacher education programs around the country. I mean, how do you carve out time to deal with assessment effectively at the undergrad level? We devote entire courses to it at the graduate level, master's level. You teach a semester-long course, or in the summer a 4 or 5 week class on assessment. And yet at the undergrad level, and even in the program that I'm in, with my fixation on assessment being an important thing, it's still given in the instrumental side of the program, you know, it's touched on one day, maybe a day and a half in the intro to music ed class, and 3 days, maybe 4 in the junior level instrumental methods class. Like I said to Caroline, I have no idea what happens on the qual side of the fence. I've occasionally been asked to go in and do a little guest talk on assessment, but I think it's probably even given less attention on that side of most music ed programs. Not that I have a definitive reason why. But anyway, I definitely feel it's an important thing. And here's one of the reasons why. Because we assume that because we've been up in front of students for a certain number of minutes, we've had them play a certain number of kinds of pieces, that somehow they've been thoroughly educated just by virtue of having experienced being in the classroom. And that is a huge assumption. Huge assumption. Because if you're not more deliberate about how you approach assessment, you can be deluding yourself into thinking that everything's hunky-dory, that everybody's understanding what they're doing, that everybody has a good grasp of the musical fundamentals. But the challenge we face is that, particularly at the secondary level, we think so much about learning being in the group environment. And it is, right? An ensemble is a group learning kind of environment. But that ensemble consists of X number of individual musicians. And when it gets down to assessment and you being able to substantiate whether a kid knows what they should know and is able to do what they should be able to do at a certain developmental level, you can't base it on sort of generalized global impressions from the group. You have to boil it down to each individual student when it comes to assessment. Does that make sense? I can't infer from a contest rating that everybody in the ensemble is equally proficient when it comes to their musical development. Now, I've had people in the field when I go out to do workshops with, particularly secondary teachers out in the field, that argue with me about that. But I bring up the analogy of football and coaches when they grade out players. They look at videotape and they are actually analyzing what each person is doing on each play in a game and grading them out. Now, if we actually had microphones attached to every stand and separate audio tracks, and you could go in and listen to what, Kelly, the 23rd flutist in the ensemble, was playing throughout the entire concert and isolated and score it, yeah, then I could say that at that point you could infer what was going on. But short of that, you're really engaging in delusion and a guessing game about, and the larger the class and the larger the ensemble, the more that's the case. So how do you boil assessment down to an individual student and not assume just because you've taught that they can learn it? So the idea is that we spend a lot of time in music education talking about planning and preparation. Not everybody does it effectively, but we spend a lot of time on it, class after class after class. And we spend a huge amount of time on the teaching part, what materials, what repertoire, what sort of pedagogical approach, pacing, all the things that we were talking about, like for the past hour and a half to preempt classroom management issues. A lot of focus on that, but not so much on assessment. And yet I'd submit that if you don't have the assessment piece, you're really limiting what you're going to be able to do effectiveness-wise with future planning and instruction, because if you're not assessing, you're not gathering information about how well kids are learning, so you're not in a position as the teacher then to make intelligent decisions about, do I reteach, do I move on, or do I have to approach something in a different way for it to really stick with the students? The assumption is, if everything's hunky-dory, you just keep moving on, right? But then you can be in a situation where you're really never addressing some fundamental issues that are reflect lack of knowledge or lack of skill from the standpoint of being a musician. So it's that ability to assess, analyze the results, interpret what that means, and then make adjustments in future planning and teaching that really leads to a very positive, kind of mutually reinforcing approach to teaching. But if there's a void in assessment, if you never really get around to formally assessing, and you're really limiting what you're able to do with students when it comes to the planning and teaching. That's the concept. So, what do I mean when I say the word assessment? I think of it as a big overarching term that refers to all the different tools, approaches, and processes you can use to collect information about and evaluate a music student's learning, which we traditionally define as what do they know, and what are they able to do as a result of music instruction. So how can you gather information about that on an individual student level so that you have trustworthy information on which to base a decision plus or a minus, or if you send home a progress report that says this versus that. Super critical. And it's not just testing. I mean, we want to sometimes reduce assessment for testing because we have the big bad boy of standardized testing out there going on. But assessment is much more broad. You don't get into that. So one of the ways that you have to think about assessment is in terms of the formality continuum. So on one hand, there can be very informal assessment. Like, as I'm engaging some of you in conversation today and I'm observing you and your body language and your eye contact and your facial expressions, I'm getting some sense of who might be really responding to things, where things might be clicking or not. But that's very superficial and I would say unreliable because some people are really good fakers as students. They'll lead you to believe it's super engaged, but maybe nothing's going on in here. It's just spinning in neutral. And in other cases, people can have more quiet, reserved personalities, but they're completely engaged in what's going on in the classroom. So the overt visceral thing can be really misleading. I can engage in question and answer. That will give me a little bit more information if the kid has to respond, kind of articulating an answer. I can do the diagnosis prescription thing within the ensemble setting. I hear a problem, fluids, let me hear you at 23. There I am again, waiting for the triangle part, but fluids at 23, and then you go through and you let's slow the tempo down. Okay, I think some of you have the wrong fingering there in measure 23. That's an F sharp, E, middle finger. Okay, let's go on. So diagnose, prescribe. That happens a lot. So that is what I would call on the fly, in the moment assessment. And it's an inherent part of good teaching. Good teachers assess within the normal context of instructional delivery. And they use that to sometimes give feedback or to make generalized impressions about what's going on in the classroom and which students are getting it and which students are not. And when you give feedback, students can start to see connections between what they're learning and what your assessment or feedback is. But the problem is this, that when teachers rely solely on informal assessment to try to understand what students are learning, they tend to do it in a much less systematic way. In other words, they might go super duper informal assessment in one class and then not so much in the next. But more importantly, they have no mechanism usually by which they can document which kids are answering questions, let alone answering questions correctly. Which kids seem to be focused and paying attention. Which kids seem to be able to meet my musical expectations in the rehearsal more often than not. We might have general ideas about how that's happening, but they're not dependable. They're not trustworthy if we don't take the time to actually engage in what would be called formal assessment. So what do I mean by formal assessment? All that stuff that you might feel you've been subjected to throughout your schooling career that causes you to go, ooh, I'm excited, I have a chance to be formally assessed and show the teacher what I know. You mean that isn't what you say when you're told that you have a test coming up or there's a major project due? I'm sure you'd say that. Yeah, we have sort of this love-hate relationship with assessment. So homework, quizzes, tests, papers, projects, presentations, all those things that you would typically have students do are considered formal assessment. And the reason they're formal is because you have to call time out on informal instruction to give students an opportunity to complete the assessment or present the project or whatever it might be. And then you actually are focusing a lot on that assessment. You're not trying to teach at the same time or manage behavior at the same time. And you're able to evaluate how well that student is doing in relation to your standards for what it says your curriculum in third grade should be able to do, or an eighth grader in choir, or a junior in band or orchestra. So, the key thing there is to allow students to demonstrate independent learning or mastery because you're not relying on group impressions. But also, you are able to do this systematically as part of an assessment plan. How often do you plan to do playing or singing tests? How often do you ask kids to do some sort of manipulative task to show that they understand a concept in general music? You can plan that all out so that you're using assessment in a very multifaceted way and on a regular enough basis so you have good samples of what the kid knows. You're not basing it on one high-stakes major exam at the end of the semester, which unfortunately happens too much in higher education, right? You get the major exam and that's the only measure of what you've learned over the semester. That's not good. But if you're systematic and you plan it out, that can be very powerful in gathering multiple forms of evidence about what a kid is learning in your classroom. But even more important than that is the fact that usually you are able to document things. You read through the paper, you observe the presentation, you score it, you assign it a grade, you put it in your electronic grade book. It counts for a certain amount of weight in the overall scheme. That's a much more dependable way to pass a judgment on what a student is learning than to base it simply on the informal stuff that you're doing on the fly in the classroom. But this is the rub. I've been working on this for like 25 years of my life, trying to convince music teachers that they need to do more on the formal side while maintaining the best of the informal, and it's a very hard sell. It's a very hard sell, because talk about traditions, one of the traditions is we just don't really pay much attention to formal assessment. We rationalize why we don't. Well, music is an art form, and we can't possibly assess whether a person is artistic or not. Well, true on the high level. I'm not going to debate Wynton Marsalis versus, Madeline Horn. But I think that when we're talking about fifth graders and eighth graders and juniors, there's a lot you can do to kind of boil down the essence of musicianship and deal with assessing, perfunctory skills and knowledge without getting into the issues of one a better artist. The other thing I hear a lot is just that, kids join secondary electives in music because they want to have a good experience. They kind of do that to get away from other subjects. The last thing they want to do is be assessed and like they are in math. Really? I mean, if that's the only reason we can entice them is to give them a break from the rest of their classes, what does that say about the integrity and value of our subject area as a core subject? So it's been a tough sell, but I think it is the critical issue of the next 25 years in terms of music continuing to have a place in school curriculum and in standards of whatever form that might be operating in education versus becoming basically a fully extracurricular community-based YMCA program. Cannot stress that enough, because if we don't somehow turn this issue over and start to have more credibility in what we assign to students as grades and the way that we assess them more regularly, I'm not sure music programs are going to stay in schools. Also, you've probably heard the terms formative and summative. So formative is just a word, I think, F feedback, formative feedback. Formative assessment is one in which to focus on trying to give students information about what are they doing well, what do they need to still work on. Usually it's in a qualitative narrative way. How many times have you been frustrated to get a paper back from a teacher and it's got a grade in a letter form circled in ink at the top and there's not a single piece of feedback on it? That nothing ticks me off more. And in fact, it's been such a big part of my own experience that now I'm known as like the feedback junkie. Because when I give graduate students, I'm mainly teaching now, but it was true when I was teaching undergrads too. I mean, I just would spend a lot of time on feedback. I felt like it was a moral obligation to attach feedback to the grade, the summative evaluation that I was giving to the students. And I can't stress that enough. Students will buy into the idea that you want them to demonstrate learning in your classroom, in a music classroom, if the idea is not just that they're chasing a certain grade, but there's actually feedback undergirding the evaluation that you're giving them. Very important. So it's a question of balance. I'm not saying informal assessment is bad. I'm saying I view it as a very important, natural part of effective teaching in the classroom. You got to engage in question and answer. You got to observe what students are doing in the classroom. But it's not enough, particularly when there's a high stakes decision involved, like are you going to give the kid an A, a B, or a C in your music class? So you need the formal assessment as well alongside. And then when you're dealing with formal assessment, I'm suggesting it's not enough just to sign grades or 4s on a rubric, but there has to be some commentary, some feedback, some information that helps students to understand why they got the marks they got. Not just, well, I threw the papers down the stutters and the ones that landed furthest down got A's and the ones that landed three-fourths of the way down got a B, and so on. That seems to be the logic from what I can tell with a lot of college teachers. So, knowledge realization that assessment, more broadly conceived as an essential part of instruction, should be used to not only to document learning, but to enhance it. Information is knowledge. Knowledge is power. Information is knowledge, knowledge is power. So if you use assessment to provide information to students, they now have power in terms of trying to figure out what they need to do with their own education to improve and grow. As musicians in your class, as mathematicians in the math class, as physical people in PE, it doesn't matter what the subject is, the assessment is information that translates into power for students. And the less that you engage in formal assessment, the more you're denying students that capability of being able to take charge of their education and realize their potential. This article that I sent you a PDF of by Sheila Scott, I think is very interesting because it talks about this idea of you can say we are assessing learning, or we're assessing for learning, or we're assessing as a means of learning. And the three quotes typifying that triad there. So in one case, music teachers are responsible for providing valid and reliable information of their students' performance in relation to a wide variety of learning outcomes. That's assessment of learning. Second quote, music teachers are responsible for providing feedback to help students interpret what they're doing well as what they need to improve and how. That's assessment for learning. You're giving them the power, the enabling them to learn more. And then music students are encouraged to reflect on assessment information, consider what they need to do to improve learning performance. That's assessment as a means of learning above and beyond what you're doing with your instruction. Into the transition point here. So, key concept, reliability. These are the cornerstones of assessment, and if you don't have these things built into place, you might as well not do any assessment, because it's going to produce bogus results. Okay? Concept one, reliability. Assessment should be relatively free of systematic error or bias and produce consistent results. That would be in this sense. If I listen to two performances on a playing test, and this performance, based on what I'm hearing, is identical to this performance, then they each should get the same score. It shouldn't be, I really like him helping me out setting up chairs in the morning, he gets a 97. And you know what, he's kind of a pain in the butt sometimes, so he gets an 8. That's bias. That's bias, that's overt bias, and then oftentimes bias is more subtle than that. But what they demonstrate in their playing is what they should get. And if it's equal in terms of what you're actually hearing, then that's the score they should be getting. Yep.
What if one student was only playing for about a year and then another student was?
Great question, but I'm going to save my response for after the break. But yes, that's an important consideration. And who has private lessons versus who doesn't have private lessons. Okay, so how do you ensure reliability in an assessment situation? You provide clear instructions about what students are expected to do. So you take confusion out of it. I don't want any kid confused about what they're going to do when they have to come in and do the quiz on Tuesday or the playing test on Friday. Let everything be known. No surprise quizzes. No pop playing tests. Everybody should know going in. Secondly, you got to create quality items and tasks that are rigorous and robust enough to prevent kids from sort of faking or guessing or gaming their way to a high score. Okay, if you make the threshold so low that all someone has to do is breathe in order to be able to get a 10 out of 10, what's the point? Control the assessment conditions. As much as you can, try to figure out ways to make things equitable for students in terms of the conditions under which they're being tested or asked to do some sort of performance task, and remove the bias from your scoring. Like, for example, can't drill down to every nuance on each of these points, but if you were giving students an essay question as part of a written assessment, which we'll get into when you look at the Sato Prelude piece that I've sent to you. One simple thing to do would be to make sure the students don't put their names on the entries. Have each student create an independent code that could be based on birthday, zip code, whatever you want to do. But what's the purpose of removing the names?
Whatever you're assessing them, you don't see the name.
You're not conjuring any image up about that person's a good writer, that person's a good thinker, that person's a good musician, based on the quality of what they've actually written in response to that essay response. And therefore, you're again removing bias from it, and you're maybe even using some sort of a scoring key to make sure you're looking for the same points in each essay and you're consistent across all the students. Okay? Validity is the question of, is what you're assessing what you've actually been focusing on in your teaching? How many of you have taken a course, high school or college, you've been diligent in going to class, you've taken good notes, you've read the assigned readings, and you get to the exam and you're like, holy crap, where did this come from? Had that experience? Okay, that happens And the reason it happens is because people designing those tests don't understand the concept of validity. And validity is this, that if you focused on it in your instruction and you've emphasized it, it should be reflected in the assessment to that same extent. If you've only touched on something slightly, then if it's reflected in the assessment, it should not be given the same amount of weight as the thing that you emphasize the heck out of. And lastly, if you've never even talked about something in class, and if it only appears in a minute section of one page on a textbook where you've assigned 300 pages of reading, you might want to rethink whether it's really appropriate to put that in the assessment. Same thing with playing tests. If you focused a lot on, rhythmic and pitch accuracy and never really dealt with diction, articulation, and bowing in the context of your rehearsals, and then you give kids a playing test and emphasize the heck out of articulation, bowing, and diction in the assessment, is that valid? I'd say there's a legitimate question about it not really being valid. So graphically it looks like this. If your goal is to really understand what students know and are able to do, the trueness is the question of validity, and the precision or accuracy is the question of reliability. And if you think about the arrow target metaphor, what you have going on right here is a case where a person is kind of reliable, but they're off target, right? Here the person's very reliable, but they're still off target. What you're going for is this, that you're on target with your assessment. It's a valid capture of what you've been teaching and emphasizing in your classes, but you're also consistent from student to student and from point in time. So with that setup, what we're going to do is after the lunch break, we're going to come back at, is it 1? And we're going to look at this piece that I sent you the PDF of. It's called A Susado Prelude. I have to pick one piece, so you're all going to be a middle school band director in the afternoon. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at that piece, and we're going to try to develop some written assessment items that would be based on the premise that I'm teaching more than the notes and rhythms in the piece. I actually want kids to understand what the piece is about. And then actually, could you create a little melodic or rhythmic etude that would capture the essence of the technique or musical expressivity that the piece is asking students to develop. And then we'll talk a little bit about how this all boils down into grading and reporting systems and the danger of everybody getting an A and what that means for our future. So, with that, thank you for being a great group. Appreciate it.